This is the 2023 BMW M2. It's got a 3-litre straight-six engine in the front, power sent to the wheels at the back, and a proper 6-speed manual gearbox in the middle. As performance cars go, it sounds like the holy grail. But before you go and spend around £65,000 on one, then hold on, because I've got an unusual alternative for you. Welcome to the Honda Civic Type R, and it's about £15,000 cheaper than the M2. And there's a good few reasons for that. For starters, it's front-wheel drive rather than rear-wheel drive. It's got about 324 brake horsepower rather than 454 brake horsepower, and, well, it's a Honda, not a BMW. So you're probably thinking, what is it doing here?
Well, the BMW M2 is supposed to offer rapid performance, excellent driver involvement and everyday usability, whether that be on a drive to the shops or down your local track. And as we know from past experience, the Honda can do all of these things very well. In fact, when we compared it with the Audi RS3 in a previous video, I reckon that it didn't really drive like a hot hatch. If anything, it drove like a front-wheel drive sports car.
But, come on, can this tuned-up family hatchback really compete with BMW's baby M car? I mean, it can't. Surely. Can it?
Well, keep watching to find out, and if you want to read the written test that features both of these cars, then make sure you take a look at the August 2023 issue of Car Magazine that's available in print, digital editions, and our very own app. But for now, let's get back to the M2.
Now obviously today we're doing this test on road. We could have done it on track, because if you go to any track day in the UK, you will almost certainly see a BMW M2 or a Civic Type R, or actually both. But because the road is where these cars are going to spend most of their time, that's where we're going to do this test. And in that respect, things have changed a little bit, because while this is the smallest and the cheapest M car that BMW makes, it's actually the same width as a BMW M4, and the Civic Type R, well, it doesn't really look like a hot hatch anymore, and it's about the same width again as an M4, so it ain't a small car anymore. And the upshot of that is that you can't really treat these cars like you used to, because while the roads are the same size as they always were, these cars definitely aren't, and that means that you need to be a little bit more careful. Which, when you're buying a hot hatch and the smallest M car, I'll say it again, well, that's kind of defeating the point, isn't it?
Also concerning is the weight of the M2. It's 1.7 tons, which is more than the Civic and even the previous M4 Coupe. We've seen in the last couple of years that BMW has moved its M cars up a notch, and as a result, even the entry-level model is obviously going to get bigger, heavier, and more expensive. On paper then, the M2 looks like it might be set to lose some of its appeal. After all, if it's the same width, not far off the same weight, not particularly cheap, and less powerful than the M4, then what are you buying it for?
Well, this is where BMW has been quite clever, because the M2 can still do things that no other M car can, and a lot of that is to do with its shorter wheelbase. If you come into a corner, you'll feel that the steering is very, very direct and precise. And it isn't that blessed with feel, but it does exactly what you want it to do. And then you'll see that while you've got an incredible turn-in, which it gets from its bigger M car brothers, there's a lot more willingness to rotate and be agile and move around underneath you. It feels so much more alive, and it's at this point that you forget that it weighs 1,700 kilograms. It doesn't feel light, but it doesn't feel that heavy. And it's a neat trick, because the weight is certainly not the thing at the front of your mind when you're driving this. You've also got plenty of range through the adaptive dampers, so you can take a rough road which is full of potholes and just generally the kind of thing that you'd want to avoid in something more serious, and use the comfort mode but still get excellent body control where everything feels super flat and composed. Or if you've got a nice smooth road, then you can put it into Sport Plus and just marvel at the way that this thing throws itself through corners. Wow, that's impressive. It really is. Go on, little M car.
Off the power or on a trailing throttle, there's huge poise at the rear end, even though you can feel the car moving around underneath you. It's only when you prod the throttle that it starts to throw some shapes, which it does very nicely with the end drift control.
You know, I was expecting this car to be a bit of a hooligan when I looked at the power figures and how much it weighed, but actually it's not. You can do those big tire shredding slides if you want to, but I think the beauty of it is when you're coming through a corner, you're mid-corner and you squeeze on the power, and as long as you're in the power band and where the torque is, you can really play with that lovely balance at the rear end and just get the car teetering between rotation and lots of oversteer. That's where it's really, really nice to use and awesome fun as well.
It's the same story with the engine. A 3-litre twin-turbocharged straight 6 borrowed from the M4. It makes about 50 brake horsepower less at 454 brake horsepower, and the torque figure is 406 pounds-foot.
Now that much power and torque in an M2 sounds incredible, and it is, but it doesn't feel like it's too much. In fact, it's a really nice balance. This particular car, the manual version, does 0 to 62 miles an hour in 4.3 seconds. And you know, that's more than enough without being crazy. What I would say, though, on the power front, is that I'd like to see a little bit more torque delivery from, say, lower than 3,000 RPM, because that's when you get to play with the balance of the car from the rear end. And below that, I can feel a bit flat. What is interesting is what this engine is like at the top end, because there's way more encouragement for you to rev it out than there ever was in the previous Gen M2. I mean, it doesn't sound particularly interesting, but it is exciting and it does egg you on to do more. I just wish this 6-speed manual gearbox was a bit nicer to use. I'm absolutely thrilled that they've still giving you the option to have it, even if you do have to pay 450 quid extra to get the manual box. But it could be a bit more tactile and it could be more enjoyable to change gears with. It's very consistent and you can get the gears quickly, although I do find that the clutch pedal doesn't return as fast as it should, so you can sometimes get a sort of blend when you're changing gear fast. But my main thing is just that BMW rubberiness that you get through the gearbox. It could, and it probably should be better. And if you ever wanted a manual gearbox to be on top form, then now is the time, because the car that I'm about to get in has possibly the greatest manual box of any production car currently on sale today.
Solid and mechanical with a brushed metal gear knob, the throw is short, snappy and perfectly weighted. The previous Gen Type R had a special gearbox, but this moves the game on even more. And believe it or not, it's not the only thing that the Civic does as a performance car that's better than the M2.
The first thing that gets you is how good this car is to drive at normal speeds, and that's because it's got a nicer gearbox, it's got a nicer clutch pedal, and also I prefer the driving position to the M2 as well. It just feels a bit more logical and cohesive. And another thing is that you can feel how well sorted this car is, even when you're just driving around at 5 or 6 or 7 tenths. And for example, both cars have a monster front end, that is not in doubt, but you have to put way more energy through the M2 to truly appreciate that. In this, I could be bimbling around at 30 miles an hour and I still get a pleasurable sensation coming up through my hands and my wrists and my arms as you just feel the precision and how taut that front end is. It's really impressive.
Much of this is inevitably to do with the curb weight. Despite having a larger footprint, the Honda weighs 300 kilograms less, and that makes a huge difference.
On the road, this feels more like a traditional sports car than the M2 does, and that's because it doesn't matter how quickly you chuck it into a corner, it just feels like it's making less effort or having to use less effort to get you through it. The M2 is confidence inspiring and capable by the bucket load, but you wouldn't say it's effortless. With this, it's almost like it's just gliding through. And yeah, not having rear wheel drive, it does have its drawbacks for sure, but the front wheel drive means that you can really attack the corners, and also if you want to just lift off halfway through, the front does tuck in and the back comes round. You don't need to do it, of course, because there's so much traction at the front and that diff works brilliantly, but it is good fun and the Civic will do it.
One area where the Civic does fall down, however, is the engine. Whereas the M2's motor has made great strides over its predecessor, the Civic's 324 brake horsepower 2-litre turbo petrol feels more accomplished but also more clinical. It's not quite as exciting as it was on the FK8.
For the last 2 or 3 generations, the Civic Type R hasn't really been about the engine, it's all about a supporting act for the chassis. But even so, while this engine actually feels more effective than the one that was in the FK8, and of course it is a development of that, it's not as exciting. It's very smooth, the power is nice and linear, but it doesn't fizz in the same way, and it doesn't crescendo up to the red line. And for some bizarre reason, it also doesn't feel quite as fast to me either. I mean, it is quick, I can see the numbers going up, but the sensation, yeah, it's not quite there in the way that I remember it being on the FK8.
If you strip everything away, however, the 3-litre straight 6 is the better engine. But what I'm interested in is how each engine feels within the context of the car that it's in. And even though the S58 unit in the M2 isn't perfect, it's a reason on its own to buy the car.
And while you don't buy a Civic Type R for its engine, it does provide a platform for the rest of the car to do its thing, and between the brilliant steering, the phenomenal gearbox, the incredible brake feel that you get, there is untold joy to be had from this thing. You know, I never thought I'd be comparing a BMW M2, a BMW M performance car with a Honda Civic, but here we are. And for the most part, this thing, it doesn't feel outgunned. I mean, that's a compliment all on its own.
Both cars' transformation into hugely fast and capable performance tools is a timely reminder of just how far manufacturers can stretch the limits of everyday cars. It's impressive but also slightly strange to see a hot hatch and entry-level M car that are this capable. In the end though, the M2 just about grabs the win. It can't match the Honda's precision or its gearbox, but it does feel like it has more layers to offer and explore. In the Civic, you can jump in and understand its capabilities within the first 10 minutes, whereas the BMW pushes to uncover more and more, revealing a satisfying, if slightly porky performance car underneath. And if you want to see how it gets on against the Porsche 718 Cayman GTS, then check out the video card that's about to roll over the end credits.